Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here this evening to Eden Hall. I'm Scott Wightman, I'm the British High Commissioner. There's some familiar faces out there, so welcome back. And for those of you who are here for the first time, a particularly warm welcome to the residents. And an especially warm welcome to our visitors from the University of London, led by the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Peter Kopelman. This is the fourth in a series of thought leadership discussions that the University of London has been organising for alumni and students of their transnational educational programmes. And I'm sure we're in for a very stimulating evening. I'm going to be at the end of the line there, just praying that nobody's going to ask me any questions about you-know-what, okay? But obviously the University of London has a very long and distinguished history, established in 1836 as the first university both that opened its doors to female students in the UK, and it remains that way up until the present day. It's, as most of you will know, it's an agglomeration of 17 different educational institutes, and collectively, they offer amongst the strongest education offers globally. They are delivering education not just to students in the UK, but also right around the world. They were a pioneer in transnational education and in long-distance learning, offering long-distance courses as early as 1858. Who would have thought that that practice, which is now so prevalent in the world, has such a long history? And it started off with the University of London. It also has a School of Advanced Study and Institute in Paris, so delivering qualifications through directly to students there as well. But here in Singapore, it's particularly well embedded. There are 7,000 students at the moment studying for University of London qualifications here in Singapore. And amazingly, there are 60,000 alumni of University of London in Singapore. And that means that pretty much approaching one in every 100 people living on this island is an alumni of the University of London, which is quite a thought and is really part of the foundation of the bilateral relationship between the UK and Singapore. This is a particularly important year for Singapore, as you know. It's the 200th anniversary of the establishment of the trading post in Singapore by Stamford Raffles and William Farquhar. A significant but really a turning point in Singapore's history, its longer history. But it's also a very significant year in the relationship between the UK and Singapore, because by definition, it's the bicentennial of our relationship as well. And our two foreign ministers at the beginning of the year, Jeremy Hunt and Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, they launched a new partnership for the future as part of the determination of our two governments, not just to look back on our 200-year relationship, but to look to the future. That partnership has four pillars, consisting of the digital economy, sustainable business and innovation, defence and security, and education, culture and youth. And obviously, the University of London are embedded in that fourth pillar. But through the programmes that they deliver, their alumni are contributing across all of the four pillars of the Partnership for the Future. It's an opportunity, the partnership is an opportunity for us to take the relationship on to the next level, to share experience and work together on some of the global challenges that we in Singapore here and in the UK are jointly facing. And so we are very much hoping that it can take the relationship forward, and that we will see more and more people recognising the value of the way in which the UK and Singapore have developed their relationship over the last 200 years. I hope this evening you will be a very engaged audience, that you will ask lots of questions, but again, I hope that they won't be too challenging, please. Okay. And now I'm going to hand the floor to Peter Kopelman. Thank you.
Can I firstly thank His Excellency for inviting us to this wonderful location and for hosting the panel meeting. It's the first time that I've experienced a High Commissioner actually giving my speech. And we see this very much as the future, not the past. And it does underline that long history of links between Singapore and the UK. And tonight, it's part of advancing that education agenda. As Scott said, there are 60,000 alumni of the University of London in Singapore. I'm so pleased to meet you tonight because I've singly failed to find that 1 in 100 this afternoon. But they're there. And in keeping with our wish to sort of extend our higher education across the world, we now have 50,000 students studying in 190 countries, 100 different programs. And they range from finance to public health, law to epidemiology, philosophy to petroleum geoscience. What I'd like to do just very briefly is to tell you about 5 new programs, just to emphasize that we in the University of London are not standing still. The first one, which we launched at the beginning, well, in fact, this month, is a Coursera's entirely online undergraduate degree in a BSc in computer science. And I've learnt a lot about computer science because now I know that there are within this degree named awards in machine learning and artificial intelligence, virtual reality, physical computing, and the Internet of Things. And the academic direction for this program comes from Goldsmiths, the University of London, so one of our 17 member institutions. Very much looking at the next generation, but also looking at those currently involved in different areas of employment to expand knowledge. And I must say I'm very taken by this. We've had expressions of interest in the program from 122 different countries, and we were astounded by the fact that there are now 600 students who started yesterday on this program. And it's going to be a very popular degree. I'm delighted that there are a number of students who have been awarded scholarships from the University of London. And I acknowledge our thanks to those within Singapore who have contributed to those scholarships. The next program is the Global MBA, which was launched last year. And this has an extensive range of specialisms that include accountancy, finance, entrepreneurship, law and leadership. But importantly, it has professional recognition from the chartered certified accountants and also from the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. We have an MSc in professional accountancy offered in partnership with UCL and the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. And at the end of this week, there's a workshop on this program. And finally, with an eye on a changing global economy, and boy, do we know this in the UK at the present time, we have a new online MSc Supply Chain Management and Global Logistics program. This incorporates the latest thinking from one of our member institutions, City's CAS Business School. And it has benefited the program from support and guidance in its development from colleagues here in Singapore. We are very proud to continue the tradition of Charles Dickens, who actually named the University of London as the People's University, and to provide access to programs from around the world. We have many distinguished alumni. I suspect there are many in this room tonight, but they include several Nobel laureates. And our graduates continue to help raise standards across the world through an appreciation of the opportunities for progress and, importantly, an understanding of the need for greater tolerance and respect as the basis for a more harmonious world. As the Ambassador Consul said, last year we celebrated 150 years of the University of London admitting women to study at university, the first university in the UK. It took another 10 years for them to be recognised to enter a degree programme. And we celebrated this anniversary with a year-long events of leading women. And this celebration included panel discussions or conversations, and there was one here held in Singapore at the National Museum of Singapore. And we're very grateful to colleagues for supporting that. And then at the beginning of this year, in January, the Chancellor, the Princess Royal, who has been Chancellor of the University of London since 1981 and is a greatly loyal to the university, she hosted the final meeting at St James's Palace, of which 26 of our current leading ladies out of 150 were present at the celebration. And I'm delighted to say that my successor as Vice-Chancellor, who starts on the 1st of July, is Professor Wendy Thompson. She will be the second female Vice-Chancellor of the University of London. So we're taking forward that tradition. Tonight's objective is really that one of providing opportunities to discuss and debate topics, and we see this as an important role for the university. On Saturday, we follow this panel discussion with the Singapore Alumni Group, and we're hosting a Career Insights with an event entitled The Effect of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Disruption on the Workplace. And we're grateful to Alex Chan for speaking at this event. We're extremely grateful to our alumni group here in Singapore, and I would encourage you to work closely with Joel Teo and Juliet Chen Tay. Joel is the president and Juliet is the secretary of the association. I close by saying, whatever your link to the university, please pass on your business cards to our member of staff. There's Bill in the front, there's Holly and Angelina who are out of the room at the present time. We very much wish to recognise your achievements and also to keep in touch. Thank you for joining us this evening. And now I'm going to turn to our panellists to earn their keep. It is quite timely we've got this debate this evening. My wife and I went round the National Museum of Singapore this morning, which is fascinating, and the background, the history of Singapore. And possibly there are parallels with Singapore in 1965 and the UK in 2019, in the sense of Singapore leaving Malaysia and the UK leaving the EU, possibly, probably, whatever. And it would be very interesting to hear from our panellists, Scott, from Oliver, and from Grace. And we have a spectrum. We have a spectrum from high-tech innovation to the importance of the creative economy, encompassing important elements of UK PLC. But Scott, would you like to start with some thoughts?
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I suppose there's a difference between 1965 and 2019 in as much as 1965 Singapore left Malaysian Federation not of its own volition, and in 2019 the UK is set on a path to leave the European Union by choice. The situation in which we find ourselves now is, as you probably know, the deadline for the departure of the UK from the European Union that was triggered by the Article 50 notification just over 2 years ago. The original deadline was the 29th of March. By mutual agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom, that has been extended to the 12th of April. If before the 12th of April the UK Parliament passes the deal that was negotiated between Prime Minister May and the European Union in November last year, if Parliament approves that, then the deadline will be extended to the 22nd of May to enable the government and the UK Parliament to complete the enabling legislation that will then ensure that we leave the European Union on the 22nd of May in an orderly fashion. If we leave on the basis of that deal, then there will be an implementation period that on the basis of the current deal would last up until the end of December, the end of 2020, and then during that period, the UK would be subject to all of the rules and regulations of the European Union, but also the privileges of membership without then having an opportunity to vote on new issues within the organs of the European Union. After December 2020, the UK would be fully outside the European Union, but by then, both parties' intention would be that we would have negotiated a comprehensive agreement that would set out the framework for the future relationship between the European Union and the UK. And both parties want that relationship to be deep and ambitious and wide-ranging. The issue that has prevented the UK Parliament from approving that deal has been this idea of the concept of the Irish backstop, as you're probably aware. And the Irish backstop would be triggered in circumstances in which at the end of the implementation period, the two parties, the UK and the European Union, had not yet finalised the negotiations on the agreement that would govern the future relationship, the post-implementation period relationship between the UK and the European Union. And the reason that has proved so contentious in the UK is because of the implications it would have for Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom, and the fact that the UK could be subject to remaining within the customs union, and in particular after the conclusion of the implementation period, for what would then be potentially an indeterminate period, and for a significant proportion of members of Parliament, that is an option or an outcome that they are unwilling to support. At the same time, there are a significant proportion of MPs as well who don't like the whole deal that was negotiated, and that has been what has it has been for that reason that so far Parliament has not approved the Prime Minister's deal. You will have seen that in a couple of debates, after a couple of debates in the House of Commons over the last 10 days or so, Parliament has held on 2 occasions indicative votes to see if a consensus could emerge from Parliament, from the House, around an alternative potential outcome. So far, that has not produced a majority. Last night, you'll have seen that yet again Parliament was unable to come to an agreement. And so, as things stand, unless Parliament reaches a consensus either in support of the Prime Minister's deal or around an alternative approach, then as things stand, we will leave the European Union on the 12th of April without a deal. It's still possible that the European Union and the UK government may agree to extend again the deadline. The European Union is making it clear that if that were to happen on a second occasion, that would need to be for a much longer period rather than just a period of a few weeks. Because in those circumstances they would insist on the UK organising elections for the European Parliament along with other member states at the end of May, the beginning of June. And they would want to be clear, they say they would want to be clear about the purpose for which this longer extension would be put in place. So they would be waiting to hear from the Prime Minister what her proposal was for how that longer extended period for the purpose for which it would be used. So all of this means that we're going through a period of frankly unparalleled political uncertainty in the UK. Certainly it's the most unstable political period in my lifetime, and arguably since the Second World War, and possibly even before that. So it's giving rise to huge passions. And the reason it's giving rise to huge passions is because the issues at stake are incredibly important for the UK. And the way it's playing out in Parliament is compelling for the rest of the world. But I have to say that I think one can, it's a frustrating process for people, but at the same time, we can take a degree of pride in the fact that the debate is being held in a civilized fashion. That we have had mass demonstrations on the streets of London and up and down the country, and yet not in these demonstrations where we've seen hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of London and many tens of thousands in other cities, no violence. This is being played out, a divisive issue is being played out in a civilized fashion. It is testing our institutions. But our institutions have, over centuries, proved themselves to be resilient. And wherever we come out in this, I'm confident that with time, and it will take time, with time we will get the country onto a positive track, irrespective of where we end up. And the significant thing, I think, for this part of the world is that since the referendum, we here in the High Commission, and I think the same thing applies to my colleagues in other posts in East Asia, we have been seeing many more British companies coming out and prospecting the market. We have been seeing many more universities coming out to Singapore, coming out not because they just want to attract foreign students to come and attend their courses as undergraduates, but coming out because they want to develop genuine strategic partnerships. They want to be promoting collaborative research on some of the groundbreaking and cutting edge areas of technology and scientific development. Because there's one of the side benefits of the referendum result has been, I think, to awaken a much greater proportion of the population in the UK to what is happening in this part of the world, to the pace of change, and to the fact that the centre of gravity, of economic and political gravity in the world, is moving away from the Euro-Atlantic area to the Indo-Pacific. And there's an understanding, a growing understanding, that the UK needs to adapt its approach and needs to be part of that changing dynamic. And so as High Commissioner here, I've been really encouraged to see the greater number of companies that are coming out here, the fact that we're seeing startups wanting to come out to Singapore rather than move to the United States as their first international move, because they want to be part of the Asia-Pacific story rather than just part of that North Atlantic story. And so I'm optimistic about our future relationship with the East Asian region. And I am certain that even though we're going through challenging times in the UK, we will get through this and that we will move on to a positive track before long. But I can also guarantee you that there will be further bumps along the road, and that there will be many people around the globe who will continue for the next few weeks to be glued to their screens to see John Bercow as Speaker managing the passionate debates that we will continue to see in the House of Commons.
Scott, thank you very much indeed. Take some assurance from that. But Grace, we'll move from technology to the creative economy, the creative arts and theatre. And in a way, your formative years, if I can put it, were in London and from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. Can you reflect on what you see Singapore, UK positions at the present time and looking forward to opportunities?
So, thank you. Thank you first for having me here. Hi, everybody. My name is Grace, and you're indeed right that I spent my formative years as an applied theatre practitioner. So it was in the UK through working and then attending Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, and then having all these wide network of opportunities and doors open for me within the UK. So I was just sharing that I worked a lot in Liverpool, in Wales, in Edinburgh. So it was the first time, I guess, in my life that I was thrust onto literally a bigger stage where there were more theatre companies and more opportunities. And also I was introduced to best practice. And it was through the UK. So we all have like an educational story, and I shared this in the last panel, where being as a Singaporean, I always knew that it's a privilege to go and study overseas. So I read theatre studies in Singapore at the National University of Singapore for my BA, and I decided I want to go to drama school. And I applied to, I think, about 10 universities, all in the UK. Because you want to go to where the Bard was from, you want to go to where Harold Pinter was from, So embedded in me was this place where, there's a longer history, but a longer history also suggests a longer process of trial and error. And that's where through this process, you move towards, closer towards best practice. And even through my process, when I interviewed for the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, it was very indicative of the years to come. Because I work as a performer, a director, so very much on the ground. It was very practical. But then I was also interested in research. And when I interviewed at Central, basically what was offered to me was praxis, which is practice and theory coming together, where a practice-based research would inform and maybe shape and change theories, oppose and challenge theories, and existing theories could then enrich certain practices. So that was that symbiotic kind of process that was being offered to me at Central. And I jumped right into it. So it was going in with the right mindset of how am I going to work? How am I going to develop myself in those years? And I had the space to then, I would say, devise, put to practice what are the ethical boundaries that would guide my practice. Because for those of you who don't know, I work in a very niche area of theatre making, which is I work with the most marginalized parts of the community. So I work with the deaf and disabled community. And in the space, in some place like UK, I managed to work with refugees, in homeless shelters, and also women in domestic violence shelters. So that really broadened the way in how I could develop and evolve my practice. Yeah, which leads me to my Brexit story, since we're on the topic of that. Everyone has a Brexit story. Yeah, so the interesting thing is, when I was in New York for 3 months in this New York City, working on a project where we were going to be on Broadway with a group of incredibly talented young people in a homeless shelter. So we had to audition them, we had to put them through a very intense month-long training period. And we had Broadway practitioners who volunteered their time to come in and train our young people intensively. Now, of course, then that's where the applied theatre practitioner comes in. It's a little bit of therapy, social work, but ultimately the art comes first. So my job was to train and practice and encourage them alongside with them. And then Brexit happened, just before we went into the theatre. And I remember my colleagues and we stayed up all night. And then my housemate, she's from Florida, and she works for the UN, and she was like, oh, if Brexit happened, do you think Donald Trump might happen? Yes, and she's from Florida, and that happened. Yeah, so that was my Brexit story. I kind of in a way, I was sheltered away from all the tensions and the high passions that was going on at that time as well. But I think from someone from Singapore, going into a place like the UK, and actually to even experience that sort of civil discourse was eye-opening in terms of my own education. And I realized that that is absolutely necessary in the creative economy that I work in. And being in such a niche part is about austerity. And that I can draw parallels with my country. When people ask me, oh, so where are you from? You speak such good English, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm from Singapore. And just like my country, I'm young, I'm scrappy, and I'm hungry. I'm absolutely hungry because when something like Brexit happens, when there are political upheavals, which always happens, artists would think about funding. And we get funding by the merit of our projects. And in a place like the UK, I realized that it's a very, very complicated funding process as it already is. And I remember I had a year-long residency. So I was offered an international residency at Grey Eye Theatre Company, which was a 30-year disability-led theatre company, the first flagship theatre company in the UK that was supported by the British Council 30 years ago with a small grant. And they went onto the streets and pulled buskers off the streets and go like, do you want to make theatre? And do you want to make theatre at a professional level? And I benefited from that year-long residency. So I would help with funding process and just being exposed to something like a 5-year diversity plan. And when funding opportunities, the pot perhaps becomes smaller, and there are always more and more creatives and artists coming into the scene, it's really the caliber and the merit of your work and the social impact. So something like the diversity plan actually put into the perspective of we cannot just make art for art's sake. It's about what humanity needs, it's about what humanity wants, and it's about culture. And where I came from, in a way, culture was, is it just the traditional arts? Is it just going to the theatre, to the orchestra, the symphony? No. My time, both coming back to the Singapore, going back and forth in the UK, and working with a plethora of international artists, really helped me consolidate the fact that what are the ethics of my work, and culture is living, it's breathing, it's creating and coexisting. And how collaborative with art and whatever that we're putting out there, the output of our labors, does the world need it in any capacity? So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you very much. Oliver, from the sort of high technology, how do you see that future relationship? Scott has mentioned the interest of UK companies. The other aspect is certainly universities and that linking for innovation at a research side. What are your thoughts?
Thanks for that question. My name is Oliver, and I spend a lot of time traveling, way too much time if you actually ask me. I've always loved traveling to London. I need to declare I am a Manchester United fan. Okay, sorry about that, but still my favorite football club. It's a very good question because R&D, research and development, is very closely intertwined with universities where intellectual capital exists. In most great ecosystems, Silicon Valley, which I spend almost 30-40% of my time today, you'll be able to see that universities are the genesis of where these thought capital comes. It's very, very important. Just the same as how Singapore has grown to be an entrepreneurial ecosystem, it's largely due to the universities that we have and the heavy investments that the government has made in education, particularly at a foundation level and then at the tertiary level itself. And that has increased the diversification of different talents in a country. We're only 5.5 million people. But if you look at the greatest entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world and you look at startups today, if you look at CB Insights, there are roughly about 330 330 unicorns in the world. So for those of you who don't know, unicorns are those companies, tech companies that are valued $1 billion US dollars and above, right? They've created new terms like decathlons, which is like $10 billion and above, right? But about 330 unicorns in the world itself, right? And US has the unassailable lead, roughly about 140 unicorns. China is close to 100. And the United Kingdom, make a guess. Anyone? Very close, about 17, all right? UK is just after US and China in terms of ranking in the number of startups that have gained billion-dollar status. That's 5% of the world's unicorn. And it goes down the list. And Singapore has roughly about 4 unicorns, right? So we're about 1% of the entire ecosystem itself. Why is that the case that smaller countries like Singapore, is able to, gain that status itself? That's because we plug into the world. We open our doors, particularly in the AI talent pool itself, because AI talent is very, very precious. If we keep our doors open, we maintain the diversification of talent into a market. That allows for a small country to be able to punch above its weight, amplify the impact that a collective country can make. And that's why Singapore is investing so much to be a smart nation of the world itself. When I look at UK from a distance, and I've got many, many affinities with UK. I spent a lot of time in UK. I spent a lot of time at Shoreditch together with, I hang out with my startup friends where we do cool stuff. We talk about everything under the sun, but we try to avoid that big V word, okay, because it will just turn them off, okay. But when I look at the kind of talent pool that they have, there are people from Ukraine, from Russia, from China, from Portugal. And I look at Singapore itself, we're no different. It is the diversification of talent that brings people together who is motivated to achieve something. And when they do, they create that impact. The location is very important. When you look at why Singapore is able to attract such talents, well, I mean, you have a lot of good things to say. Good food, weather is good, a little bit hot, right? Low income taxes, and we keep our doors open, right? I think, UK for a country of 66 million people, with a GDP of roughly about $2.9 trillion dollars itself, okay, has done extremely well. More than 5 billion pounds of VC money is poured into UK since 2017. This is by far the biggest in any European city itself. Why is that the case? Because of the intellectual DNA and the diversification of the talent that exists within UK. And UK will continue to punch above its weight if the doors are always kept open. I think that's what most ecosystems like to do. And for startups as well as more established startups, 3 things really upset them. It is the uncertainty over the ability to recruit talent and retention of talent. It is the regulatory divergence. It creates a lot of uncertainty. And the last thing is really about access to intellectual capital, all right? Both money as well as the smart money, really. So when I look at UK and draw comparisons with a smaller country like Singapore, I would say Singapore has constantly kept its doors open. I hope UK does as well. For the sake of my founder friends over in London itself, and But I also like to point out that we are living in a very unprecedented time today. We're going into what we call the fourth industrial revolution, which is characterized by heavy digitization as well as artificial intelligence. And AI, it's permeating national borders. As we harden our traditional borders, whether it's custom barriers or trade barriers, artificial intelligence does not know any boundaries. I like to say this, right? Because the same jobs that exist in assembly plant today in the United States, that's already being replaced by robots. In some banks in China today, your loans application is being assessed by a smart algorithm, no longer a loans officer. The call center person that you're speaking to, that sounds wonderful, all right, might be a robot, probably is a robot, okay. The technologies exist today, and it will come. And, for the same jobs that we're trying to save in the factories itself, the same entrepreneurial people who are going to embrace these AI technologies in UK is going to introduce this into the automation process. So it's really about, reskilling, it's retraining, and moving people up the value chain. Of course, there are jobs that AI and robots cannot replace. For instance, in elderly care, where human empathy is required. In the arts, for instance, you can't ask robot to dance as beautifully as Grace, maybe. Okay. So there are things that robots cannot get there. But I would say AI is permeating almost every market in the world today. And that is something that I think if countries, particularly governments, is able to appreciate and understand its omnipresent impact for the future, the sooner we embrace that, the sooner we start to plan for it, the better we are be able to grasp the opportunity that it presents. I think that's my view about the hardening borders that exist, whether it's the Mexican war or the trade war that exists with China and US. These are traditional trade wars, but AI is going to change, many ways of improving the lives that we live on an everyday basis. Thanks.
Oliver, thank you very much. I'm going to open it for questions in one moment, but what I wanted to do was ask Grace and Oliver and Scott. Grace, you used the term young, scrappy and hungry. I was in a discussion in Parliament a little while back when one of the MPs said, "Isn't this exciting? We're living through history." And I made the point that actually that history will visit the next generation, a generation who possibly would have voted to remain in Europe. How do we keep young people engaged, scrappy and hungry?
That is a big question. I think, that reminded me of the kind of work that I do. And recently I've been in the mainstream education system quite a bit, where trying to create, I run a series of programs, it's called Effective Performance Making, where it creates a space where young people in Singapore, highly stressed young people in Singapore, have a space to try things out and say what they want to say, to express themselves. And I think we go along the theme of self-image and self-identity. And these are, I get deeply, deeply distressing results. I do, and it's very worrying. And recently, I think there was an article about the rise in mental health conditions and illnesses in our young people. So our young, I don't know if they're very scrappy or they're very hungry, if they're not perhaps working in the cultural or the arts sector. Because in Singapore, it does run like a wonderful, well-oiled machine. And if you are a cog, a beautiful cog in the machine. Often than not, there are always exceptions. You know, things get to you get to progress through life. You know, but what I'm concerned about is resilience. The resilience and that requires creative problem-solving skills. And for me, as a theatre practitioner, I think what I can do is to reach out to more young people, one person at a time, and really try to create that safe space.
So, from a sort of academic point of view, is that broad curriculum? Because if we turn to Oliver now, I mean, young people are very, very keen on technology.
Oh yes, they are.
Advances. How do we keep the balance?
Good question. I'm honestly trying very hard to keep my own 3 kids away from YouTube all the time. Well, I mean, we're living in a different era. I mean, for me, I've crossed the internet era where I moved from the analog to the digital world. So I could resonate with what's in the old world itself. Today's youngsters and millennials, they're born digital natives. My 17-year-old son doesn't know what is television. To him, television is YouTube, Netflix, on demand, not linear. So it's difficult to draw a comparison with the old when they have never lived in the old. And I've always liked to encourage them, as well as the youngsters of the world who are born digital natives, to also appreciate the cultural side of history and how we have evolved over time, and not just talking about like years, but really long time ago. All right, and that would give them a much better perspective how we've moved from the 18th century to 19th century to 21st century, because the length of time tells a better story than 2 years ago, because 2 years ago, YouTube was still there. What's the difference, right? I've constantly kept my kids apprised of what's developing around the world, and it's a very interesting topic that we're discussing, borderless issues in a bordered world, because his world, my 17-year-old son, he thinks that the world is more connected by Facebook, by WhatsApp, and all of these social media that exist. And at the same time, we are seeing the realities of, hardened borders. So for me to encourage him is to really bring him into other countries. I try to travel with him as much as I can to be able to explain the better side of developing countries and how they are able to grasp the technology. I would say education forms a very strong part of the equation.
Scott, any comment from your UK view in Singapore?
It's quite difficult to comment other than on the basis of your own personal experience. And I've got 2 daughters of 25 and 21, both of whom, as it happens, one's a graduate of UCL and the other's attending UCL at the moment. And I look at them and I understand a little bit about their peer group, their friends, and they seem to me to be motivated in different ways from certainly my generation, which I suppose is not at all surprising. But their concerns are more global than would have been the case when I was a student. One of my daughters is very motivated by issues around sustainability, and the other's very motivated around issues to do with gender equality and issues to do with income inequality and development. And I think that is partly a reflection of having a global perspective, not seeing themselves being bound by borders. And I think that that's a fruit of the education that they have received. And so I agree with you that education is a really critical element here. And it's critical if we're going to maintain cohesion within our societies, because the disruption that's on its way from AI and data for sure is going to create lots of new jobs. but the risks of social dislocation between now and then, I think, are real. And the real public policy challenges that are going to face governments right around the world as the technological and the data revolution impacts on societies, I think are going to be how you manage, how our governments manage the tensions and ensure that the digital divide that is definitely going to develop doesn't become a source, a really deep-seated source of conflict and tensions within societies. So, I mean, I think Singapore is, the government here has always, and society as a whole, has always placed a huge premium on education. And I think the really interesting thing that we're seeing in Singapore now from government ministers involved in the education sector is their determination that the success that Singapore has had in educating its population in the core subjects, and in particular around science, technology, mathematics. They don't want to lose that, but there's a clear understanding from Singapore ministers that they need to ensure that their young people who are going to be entering the job markets over the next 10, 15 years, that their critical thinking capabilities are increased, and that they have that space for creativity, that does become part of the educational journey of students. So I suspect that the young Singaporean adults that we will see emerging in 10 or 15 years' time will look a bit different from those that we've seen hitherto, and that they will have that great technical capability in terms of their education, but they will have that additional dimension, and that will make them, and so Singapore as a whole, better able to confront some of the challenges that are going to emerge as a result of the data revolution.
Thank you very much, Scott. Questions?
Yeah, maybe a question for Grace. Can the UK further use arts and culture to promote arts and culture in the world, to export it around the world, so that they're a bit more plugged in the global world, so that they continue to establish and build affinity with global citizens? How can the UK use arts and culture in furtherance of that objective?
That's a great question. So when it comes to arts and culture and also inclusive, diverse practices, the UK is definitely considered a cultural leader in that aspect. And I talked about best practice earlier on. So I have a very long-term and meaningful relationships with many esteemed, highly qualified UK practitioners. And the idea is we will trying to keep doors open, and that means them coming out and for practitioners from different parts of the world to go there as well, just to keep those channels open. And in a time where, for us, it's always austerity all day, every day. And so I think it has come to this point where it's about aligning our values and goals and purpose of every project and pulling resources. So in a sense, when you do pull your resources, and the work can travel to further places, and I think there's also a change in mindset. In the past, it used to be a little bit more top down because they have the benefit of research, of experience, and the learning process was quite top down. But I think that mindset has shifted from a more Eurocentric perspective to a more localization even, where my collaborators are highly interested in finding commonality. So, for example, the recent project that we did is about disability in both Singapore and the UK. And because we pulled resources, the funding came from both sides, we managed to tour the UK and open at the National Museum of Singapore as well. And also embracing technology, we realized that this is such an important work. So we actually live streamed the first theatre production in Singapore so that our this deaf and disabled community around the world could actually tune in, especially people who might not be able to physically access the theatre. So it's always about coming together and being really, really creative and sharing. There's always this sharing and pooling of resources, and with the right mindset, with the right purpose, and like I was mentioning earlier, you know, with the right intentions, the support is there. The support is there, and the work can go further, but not as a UK-led, but as an artist-led, as an international collaboration-led kind of process and product.
I'm just curious. I have 4 kids, and the eldest one is in secondary 3. And on the topic of Brexit, I told her I'm coming for this session, and she went like, "What's that?" Okay, I think to be real, there doesn't seem to be a lot of emphasis, or at least in her school, to understand what is Brexit. I think for us, definitely we're looking out what's happening. We know the trade, the effects on the trade. You're going to have taxes that's going to be placed when things get imported to UK. This is a whole different spectrum. But I was just asking myself, what if Singapore was in a situation like this back like in 1965? Would the current citizens actually bother? Would they know what's in there for them? And I see, like you said, Scott said, the civilized demonstration, putting a point across. I don't know, will that happen here? So I'm just seeking your point of view, the differences that you think it will be for Singapore if we're in the same situation, leaning to leave maybe a union with our neighbors on the north. Would there be some similarities, or do you feel that really different people in UK, the teenagers or youngsters in UK are having a stronger point of view versus what we would have here?
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised that you're. In fact, I'm pleased that your children don't really know what's going on, because they should have better things to concern themselves with. No, I mean, seriously, it's a long way away. It's a long way away, and the impacts on Singapore of whatever is the result are going to be marginal. I mean, there will be impacts, but whatever happens, they will be marginal. And the fundamentals of the relationship between the UK and Singapore are so strong. The people-to-people relationships, the two-way investment, the educational relationships, the relationships between our professions are so strong that they will ride out all of that. So I'm not surprised that your children are not particularly either informed or concerned. And you should reassure them that they don't need to be either informed or concerned about it. I think it's highly unlikely that in Singapore the question would ever have been put to the population in the first place. I suspect that political leaders here would have considered that the subject was too complex, and that that Singapore's leaders themselves were better placed to make judgments on the question. I also suspect that the idea of a large-size demonstration in Singapore on the subject that's quite hard to envisage. But what's not hard to envisage is Singapore having a civilized conversation about these sorts of subjects. And I think that again comes back to the question of education. The citizenry in Singapore are well educated and they are well informed, and so they are perfectly capable of having a sustained and well informed debate and discussion about complex issues. But I think they are more trusting of their politicians to take decisions that are in the best interests of Singapore. So the differences between the two situations are significant, and therefore I think the issue would play itself out in a different way in Singapore.
I'm interested to understand that in terms of impact of Brexit to your supply chain? Because earlier on you talk about you're introducing something on in international supply chain, so that is going to correlate to all the issues that's happening in the world today. So can you share with us a bit more about this thing in relation to the international supply chain, if it will maybe impact the region in Asia Pacific?
Not just in a global context, but particularly in a European context, the single market has meant, the development of the single market has meant that manufacturing supply chains in Europe now are highly complex and based on just-in-time production processes. In the political declaration that was negotiated at the same time as the withdrawal agreement by Theresa May with other European leaders, that political declaration about the future relationship talked about a very close alignment of regulation after the UK had left the European Union, and the ambition to achieve as frictionless trade as possible between the UK and the European Union. Because on both sides, I think there's an awareness that the nature of these supply chains now are so complex that it's important, it's in the interests, economic interests of EU countries, and it's certainly in the economic interests of the United Kingdom to try to minimise whatever disruption might ensue as a result of the UK's departure from the European Union. This is what it's this issue that is making those who are opposed to a no-deal Brexit most concerned about the potential impacts of a no-deal Brexit. Because if we were to leave the European Union on the 12th of April without a deal, which is not the government's objective by any means, but if that were to happen, and it's still a possibility that it could happen, if that were to happen, then there would be, at least in an initial period, quite severe impacts on those highly complex supply chains in Europe. Now, large companies have been taking steps, British companies, but also European companies, have been taking steps to put in place contingency plans to manage the potential disruption. And our government, over a period of months, has been trying to raise awareness amongst companies about trying to work through and understand what the implications could be of a no-deal Brexit for them. But I think it's unrealistic to believe that there would be no disruption. There would be disruption, and it would take a period of time for those effects to work their way out until we got to a new sort of equilibrium and a new arrangement for supply chains within the European rather than just the EU market.
You mentioned about talent diversification and also cross-skilling and upskilling and all that. Now, when you talk about the tech disruption, right, and how it's coming at a full force, with that, the laws also evolves and becomes very rigid and stringent in terms of talent mobility, right? Now, from Singapore's perspective and also UK's perspective, I think they're both very dynamic markets here. How do you see in terms of talent mobility becoming more robust, and or is it going to paralyze talent mobility further? Because what's really happening is so I just actually came back from the UK, because I was actually exploring employment opportunities, and as a HR practitioner, I've been very, very conscious about trying to upskill and cross-skill and just keep myself abreast with the latest skills that's really going to be the game changer from that domain. But what I'm finding is that many employers are not very receptive or very accepting towards, sort of like really embracing that diversity in talents, right? So basically what I'm asking is that going to be, when you look at talent from the talent landscape, is that going to really keep talents within the respective, countries, or because of the laws that evolves together with all this disruption, that's really going to be very challenging to explore and seek new opportunities?
Okay, there's a question on diversity of talent and there's a question on mobility. I think that these are two quite different issues. Let me try to address the mobility issue first. AI will displace jobs. I'm just saying it's a matter of fact, all right? It will displace jobs. It may be hard for some politicians to say it out loud because of the electorate that they serve, but it is what it is. The reason why AI will displace jobs is because these same jobs that used to be held by humans, the employers, their trainers, or the governments that looked after them have not planned ahead for these disruptions. And that's why disruption happens, and that's where mobility is being hampered. There is this study that came out from the US. I'm not sure, I can't remember the name of it, was some think tank. About 1/3 of American kids who enter the school today will be one day be employed in jobs that do not even exist today. That is the matter of fact. If you can think forward and start preparing about these jobs that do not exist today, then you have time to prepare for that. If you are disrupted because you're not prepared, you have not embraced, or you've been resisting the transformational process that comes in, then we will have a mobility issue. And that will be a very, very challenging one to solve because you will be moving from one job to the next that still does the same process that was being replaced by a robot or by a smart algorithm. Moving on to the other question, which is on talent diversification. So for me, I operate in the AI world today. I compete with the best AI companies out there. So I do understand how precious AI talents are. I always say this, the new currency of AI is not money, it's actually talent. It's how talent comes together, and the diversity of these talents, if we cannot grow them here in Singapore, what do? We acquire them. We offer them employment permits, citizenship, if you will. If you have read Lee-Khoo's AI Superpower, I think you'll be persuaded by how serious China as a country is doubling down on AI. The mass amount of determination and the talent draw that they bring back from the US. The same students who studied at Stanford, at MIT, they're all coming back to China to contribute to that economy, will make China a formidable AI superpower. Already, if you look at the 7 AI superpowers, non-state actors, the Facebook, the Google, the Apple, the Amazon, and the three Chinese companies, Tencent, Baidu, and Alibaba. The combined valuation of these companies far exceeds the GDP of UK alone. Can you imagine the power of all of them if they only collaborated rather than competed? So how did they gain that diversity? If you read Google's background, it's Sergey Brin and his co-founder. They were Russians. All right. Look at Microsoft today. The CEO is not a native. He was actually an immigrant. So America has gotten, well, rather Silicon Valley. I shouldn't say America because it's too big. But Silicon Valley has gotten so big because of its enriched pool of talent that it has brought in. That's being fueled by intellectual capital. That's being fueled by culture. That was how Silicon Valley started. I mean, for a small country like us, we can't replicate what Silicon Valley has, but we have our own characteristics. And I think our government has taken wise steps to plan going forward. to teach AI in schools. I'm even very encouraged that even our Institute of Technical Educations are now embracing artificial intelligence as part of their curriculum because they want to plan going forward. I think that's a better way to bring the two subjects together.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you, the panel. Well, before I conclude, I'm just going to express a concern because it is the next generation. We very much focus on the next generation. My concern is shared between London, the UK, and Singapore. I'm not certain why we have a forearm now, because you could see the next generation will not have a forearm because it's much easier to put your mobile phone to your face without that forearm. But it's been fascinating this evening. We've moved away from Brexit, which I'm delighted to say, but the next generation very much see the world as borderless. One of my kids sees no borders and travels the world the whole time. And it is the next generation we need to focus on. It is that combination of understanding, advancing technology, but to have that appreciation of culture and the sort of a creative economy, which the UK still holds. And it really is developing, consolidating that partnership between Singapore, UK, SG, UK going forward. And I do feel very sincerely that the University of London continues to have a very important role because education is the dominant factor in the future. Can I thank our panelists? And I thank Grace, Oliver, and I particularly thank Scott for permitting us to host this panel in this wonderful venue. Thank you very much.